With that deep dive at how Flutter manages all of that, let's see which build methods actually get called for which actions. For that, let's go to the main Dart file, and there in the build method of the my homepage state class, I'll add a print statement where I simply print build my homepage state so that we can see in the log when this method executed. I'll do the same in the transaction list widget in the transaction list Dart file. There in the build method, I'll also run build for transaction list. The same for the chart here. There in the build method, I'll print build chart, and for the chart bar, there in the build method, I also want to print chart bar. You could also add it to the adaptive flat button if you wanted to, but I'll print it for these widgets. Now with that, if you have an emulator up and running and connected, do a full restart here with that green arrow in the top right corner here. And let's see where build now gets called in our app. Before we touch anything, let's already go back here to the debug console. And what we see here is that build gets called in my homepage state. Then it gets called in chart, then in the chart bar. And then actually this means that it is called 5 times more in the chart bar. So we would have the same output as we have here, 5 times more, which is why the debug console kind of wraps this together into one log. But we would have 5 times, and overall with this log here, 6 times chart bar being logged. And then the transaction list build method runs. Now let's refine this actually a bit by going to the chart widget here. And there for the constructor, I'll remove the semicolon and actually add a constructor body. You can still use this shortcut with this and then the argument name which matches your property name. But here I will now also print constructor chart so that we also see when this constructor runs. I only did it here for the chart. You can of course do it for other widgets too. So again, time for a restart, and now let's see what happens in the debug console. We see my homepage state gets called, then the constructor of chart gets called, then the build method of chart, and then the build methods of chart bar and transaction list. This output makes a lot of sense, of course, because the main Dart file is our entry point. There we run app with my app when the app launches. My app is a stateless widget, which in the end simply instantiates the my homepage widget there. So my homepage is created here. That creates its state, and when the state is created, the build method in the state runs, and that is why we see my homepage state first. Then this build method executes, and therefore Flutter instantiates all these widgets here, all these Dart classes here, and therefore, since we added our logs to, for example, the chart widgets, we see output regarding that. We're not in landscape mode, so hence we see here that we render a container with the chart, and then we render our transaction list widget. So here chart gets created, an instance of the chart class, which is why the constructor of chart is executed. And then since this all is a widget, Flutter goes ahead and calls the build method in chart. Now inside of chart and its build method, there of course we see that all these chart bars get built in the end. Of course, we have a bunch of other widgets getting built as well, but we didn't add any print statements in there, which is why we see no output for these. But the chart bar here gets created, and of course we create this chart bar 7 times, not 6 times as I said before. Of course we have 1 plus 5 plus 1 output, so 7 times chart bar here, because we have chart bars for 7 days. Now once these chart bars are created, and once this part of the widget tree is done, Flutter actually goes back, because here it isn't done. It now built the chart with all its child widgets. Now the next line is executed. If we're not in landscape mode, this is this line here. And then we build the transaction list widget, which is stored in a variable up here. And there we in the end build our transaction list widget. And therefore we see build transaction list, because in the transaction list widget, the constructor gets executed. We have no log for that, which is why we don't see that in the log down there, but we have a log in the build method, and that is executed when a new instance of transaction list is created. So this is how build runs when the app starts. Now let's do something. If I open that overlay here, for example, nothing changes here. Nothing rebuilds. Let me clear the debug log with this button so that we can see fresh messages easily. And now let me tab into title here. Without typing anything, you see that now my homepage state actually was rebuilt. On first look, that could be strange because when you tap here into your input field, we certainly don't call setState. But remember that earlier I said that build is not only executed when you call setState, but for example also when the media query or when the theme changes. Now the theme hasn't changed, of course, but the media query did. The media query also holds information about the view insets. That's something we take advantage of in new transaction. Here, we're referring to the view insets data stored in the media query to find out how much space is occupied by the soft keyboard so that we can actually move our content up by that space. So since this is part of the media query object changes, and this is a special kind of widget to which I'll come back, which automatically triggers rebuilds of all the widgets that refer to it. And just because that is important, it doesn't care about whether you actually are only interested in the view insets or in something else. Any widget which uses media query off will rebuild no matter which data you then access from there. So this is why the build method of our my app or my homepage state component rebuilds or reruns, because there we are using the media query off object because we need it here for the orientation. Orientation hasn't changed, but as I mentioned, whenever something in the media query changes, everything that depends on media query will rebuild. So that's why build here runs when we open the soft keyboard. And then of course, as you learned that build runs, this code gets parsed, all these widgets are recreated, new instances are created, and therefore we also create a new chart, all these new chart bars, and a transaction list. Now of course this might sound very inefficient now. Just because media query changed, even though we're not using a feature of media query here that did change, we rebuilt this entire tree. Isn't that a problem? It's not a problem because for one, as you learned, rebuilding the widget tree is really not that bad. It doesn't mean that Flutter has to rebuild the entire user interface and recalculate everything there. So rebuilding the widget tree is way less expensive, way less problematic than rebuilding everything. And therefore rebuilding the widget tree is a core mechanism of Flutter and really not bad. But of course, what you can always do in your apps, and what you should do, especially in bigger apps, is that you try to split your codes into widgets such that you have certain features which cause regular rebuilds, like media query changes, only in some widgets and maybe not in your main widget tree, like we have it here, that holds essentially your entire app. For tiny apps like this one, where you only have one page, so to say, only one real section, right? We only have that personal expenses tracker. We have no user profile or anything like that. So for apps that only happen on one screen, it's not that uncommon that your main widget tree changes a lot. But if you have bigger apps, you might consider splitting your app efficiently so that the parts that do change often are confined or contained in their own widgets so that they don't spill over into other widgets. Because, for example, if something would change only in the chart widget, only the build method there would be called, and therefore all these widgets would be recreated, and the chart bar would be recreated. But rebuilds here in the chart would not spill over to our my homepage or my homepage state class here. This build method here would not be called if a child widget of it, like the chart widget, rebuilds. That's just something important. So splitting your apps efficiently is a good idea, but always keep in mind that build calls and the widget tree being rebuilt is generally not problematic and a core functionality of Flutter. And Flutter manages this efficiently to not rebuild the element and the render tree all the time.